Hello to everybody attending this lecture. It is entitled The Embodied Citizen. My name is Helen Schenken, and I'm a sociology professor for migration and society at the University of Osnabrück in Germany. The topic for today is the embodied citizen. This lecture pays in particular attention to gender equality, one of the founding principles of the European Union. Therefore, we will start with the first question: what is gender mainstreaming, and do all European countries value it equally? Gender is an important social category, however, not the only one. Therefore, I will respond in the second part to the question, we are all embodied citizens, but why do some of us face more discrimination than others? The title of this week's session is The Embodied Citizen. However, in the European Union live many non-citizens. Therefore, the third question is, what does it mean for non-citizens who are also embodied subjects? We will begin with some conceptual notes to bind together body and citizen or citizenship. And hereby I refer to some feminist theorists. So what effects do policies have on bodily subjects? And when does a governing through bodies take place? Who has which degree of control over his or her body? Raven Connell considers bodies as a linkage between subjects and social structure. Quote, bodies cannot be understood as just the objects of social processes. They also must be seen as sharing social agency, quote end. Two Australian sociologists or political scientists, Carol Bacci and Beasley, identify in most policies and in academia a dichotomy between full citizens that have full control over their own bodies and versus lesser citizens that have less control over their bodies or who are even controlled by their bodies. So, but Bacci and Beasley also say that the situation is far more complicated. Some of you might think, okay, women are controlled by their bodies, but that's not the case. It really depends on the policy field and the concrete social situation. And in this lecture, we will also focus on non-citizen, because most literature so far focuses on citizens and unequal control over their bodies. So now we turn to the first question. In the European Union, the social category of gender plays an important role. There have been changing terminologies for gender equality. Nowadays, gender mainstreaming is the principle at work. So what is gender mainstreaming? And do we see in all EU member states the same picture? Therefore, we will start with a brief inventory of the state of gender equality in the European Union. Gender mainstreaming is defined by the European Union's Gender Institute as, quote, a strategy towards realizing gender equality. It refers to the integration of a gender perspective into every stage of age intervention. So the preparation, the design, the implementation, the monitoring, and the evaluation of policies, of regulatory measures, and of spending programs. The aim is to promote equality between men and women in all spheres of life, quote end. In the European Union, gender mainstream is a binding policy principle for the EU institutions and also for the member states. We cannot go here into detail. In case you're interested in more nuanced debates also about the different types of gender mainstreaming, please consult some of the recommended authors' works. Let's have a look at gender equality in different European member states. The European Institute for Gender Equality has set up a statistical instrument to monitor gender equality in core thematic fields, the Gender Equality Index. It measures how well member states perform, together with how successful they are at closing existing gender gaps. The index is built around 6 core domains: work, money, knowledge, time, power, and health, and 2 satellite domains: violence against women and intersecting inequalities. Here you see the overall aggregated results of the Gender Equality Index 2015. It is organized clockwise in an alphabetical order of the country names, or the abbreviations, and the numbers are not absolute numbers, but percentages and refer to previous results and considerations. We just take them as a proxy to see that the overall gender performance varies between member states. But in all member states, men's overrepresentation in decision-making position remains prevalent, both in politics and in economics. The domain of time reveals the very unequal division of unpaid work between men and women in the private sphere. And this remains one of the greatest barriers to gender equality. And again, that's a result for all countries. Some of you might have guessed that the Nordic countries in the European Union score highest. Yes, they do. While it might be astonishing for some of you that some of the newer EU member states, especially with a former socialist history, score lowest. Wasn't the labor force participation of women rather high? Also full-time affordable public childcare available? And gender equality a policy principle? What happened? Andrea Krizan found that during the post-1989 situation, costly benefits and services supporting women's dual role as worker and as mother, a feature of the socialist past, often considered women-friendly, have changed dramatically. And that's why we can explain some of the increasing gender gaps in the post-socialist countries. I mentioned the term gender gap. Gender gap is often used when talking about differences between the genders. Let's have a look what this means and how severe it is. A gender gap is by definition the difference between men and women. We can identify gender gaps or gender biases in all fields and all policies. If the gender gap is 0, there is no gender gap, but gender equality. When we take the data from the European Gender Equality Index on access to work, and here in particular access to full-time paid employment, we see the following picture. We see that, for example, the full-time employment rate for women is highest in Sweden, 60% almost, but also quite high in the Czech Republic, Austria, or Cyprus. However, this is related to the overall full-time employment rate for men and women, and the question whether men and women have similar access to full-time employment. If not, that's what is meant by a gender gap. We have in Spain, for example, a relative low number of full-time employment of women, but partly given because of the economic crisis, also of men, which means that the gender gap is only a bit more than 10%. In Austria, the rate of full-time employment of full-time employed women is around 52%, but the gender gap lies with a high 20%. So the gender gap across all European Union member states ranges from 7% in Lithuania to 30% in Malta. So there's really a huge difference between the different member states. So how can we explain these differences? To better understand these differences in different societal spheres, the concept of gender regime or gender order is useful. It refers to the gendered patterns in a society. A lot has been written about it, and on the top you can see some of the authors you might want to read. Here I refer to 3 basic types in Europe. So there are countries called non-interventionist, where the work-family reconciliation is seen as an individual issue. So it should be solved in the private sphere or with market-based solutions. A case in point is the UK. A second model is the familialistic model, built on the principle of subsidy. So it's also a private issue, the lower level of family policies and public care infrastructure. So everything is solved within the family and not on the market basis. Some of the Mediterranean countries are here good examples. Then there's a third model, the defamiliaristic model, where care is seen as a public issue and public policies and subsidies are quite well developed, and there is a dual earner and dual carer model. Some of the Nordic countries are examples here. Of course, not all countries fit into this model, especially France is a very difficult case, but also countries such as Germany are kind of mixed models. But these different types help to understand the different performances in these countries. So the different models persist. However, we have a European Union gender regime as well. And in gender studies, there is a debate about it. So what is more influential, the European level or the national one? And no doubt, the different gender regimes continue to coexist. On the European Union level, there is an EU gender regime that, to quote Lombardo and colleagues, contributes to fixing the meaning of gender equality, quote end. There is a history in the European Union about gender equality, basically going back to equal pay for equal work. There are key actors that are quite influential on shaping gender policies, the European Commission, the Parliament, and also the European Court of Justice, expert groups, and so on. And then we have hard law, the treaties, and also secondary law, where we have an understanding of gender equality. And also soft law has relevant impact. Angelika von Waal argues that there is a trend towards a convergence in the member state through EU policies and EU court rulings. This perspective, however, is countered by scholars like Johanna Kantola. They say, no, we don't have a convergence, but certain gender regimes, for example in the Nordic countries, they come under pressure by the EU gender regime. And Johanna Kantola identifies different shifts and shifting logics through Europeanization in terms of gender equality. And there is a shift, for example, for the Nordic countries, from an equality of outcome to equal opportunities to participate economically and politically. So not the outcomes matters, but the general opportunities. There is a focus more on the individual and less on social structures of inequality, and it moves from positive action and welfare policies to anti-discrimination. The focus is more on the law and less on political interventions. And from gender to multiple inequalities, which I will deal with in the next section. So we have a continuing, gender equality, there are continuous differences, but at the European Union level, there is a gender regime that puts certain countries under pressure. And the government's relationships differ. So some embrace European Union approaches, while others ignore them, while others resist to them. So to give a brief response to the first question, gender mainstreaming is an official EU policy. Gender equality performances differ significantly. The national differences continue to be significant. And there is an EU gender regime with specific features and an impact on national gender policies. So let's turn to the second question. We have seen that also the Nordic model of gender equality has been criticized, that not all women profit from it to the same degree. In particular, that immigrant women are not meant by it, because it is based on the idea of common interests and common identity of all women. In Denmark, for example, gender inequality has in recent years been discussed as a cultural issue, with immigrants having a gender equality deficit. Thus, in the following session, I will discuss the issue of multiple, or to be conceptually more precise, intersecting forms of inequality and discrimination. So what is meant by intersectionality? It means not to refer to a single analytical category like gender, but to take into account, and here I quote Leslie McCall, one of the key authors in the field, relationships among multiple dimensions and modalities of social relations and subject formations, quote end. So it's about relationships. And here you see different visualizations, attempts to show how these different dimensions intersect. Different authors have different explanations and models. Is it a chain, or is it a layered system, a hierarchical, or is it more like a crossing at a street? So we won't go into detail, but have a look at the European Union and how intersectionality is dealt with. So after the Amsterdam Treaty in 1997, the issue of discrimination in the plural became much more discussed, because the treaty mentions a range of sources of discrimination, such as gender, age, religion, sexual orientation, or ethnicity. And here we can draw a line to the first part of the lecture on different equality models and their rationales in favoring a perspective of anti-discrimination instead of substantive equality. So how severe is intersectional discrimination in the EU? Also the EU would like to know this, but it has had a hard time in obtaining valid data for its 2015 report on gender equality. Nonetheless, we can observe some trends. And the most important one is that gender matters most, we can say. So women from all categories, immigrant, non-immigrant, age, ability, disability status, rural, urban, etc., have, for example, lesser access to the labor market. And in particular, age also matters. A higher age and a migrant status aggravate the situation of these women. So a brief response to the second question. We have intersectional discriminations, and the EU responds to them in its institutional framework by an approach of anti-discrimination. And the impact of the gender equality framework is also controversially debated, and I will refer to that also a little later. But now let's turn to the final section where I would like to talk about non-citizens in the EU. We are, of course, everybody's an embodied subject, whether citizen or non-citizen. But for non-citizen, specific regulations are valid. And sometimes it is quite complicated to understand who has which access to social, economic, or political rights. A theoretical concept that helps us to grasp these rights dimensions is the one of stratification of rights. A basic assumption is that a distinction between citizens and non-citizens is too simple. Rather, the same individual may benefit from certain social rights, but not political rights. Emma Carmel and Regina Powell have identified alone 12 different categories in the EU. And here we see we have different categories of EU citizens, we have long-term residents, family members, different categories of temporary workers, and also 3 different categories of international protection. So it is quite complicated. And we also need to add the category of undocumented migrants with even much fewer rights. Also, Ilka Otak and Siglinde Rosenberger underwent the tedious work of systematically listing the economic, social, and political rights the different categories of migrants have. They found that there is, concerning economic rights, a clear hierarchy between the different categories, from highly skilled migrants to, for example, seasonal workers. In terms of social rights, they note in the EU over time an expansion of rights, but still the distinction between contributory and non-contributory benefits makes the difference. To conclude my presentation, I would like to draw your attention to the troubling situation of refugees and migrants coming by boat via the Mediterranean Sea to the European Union. We have talked in this session about embodiment, about rights, about equality and other issues. So these migrants and refugees belong to the group of non-citizens without control over their bodies. And here we see an image, some media images. And in media, these migrants and refugees are often portrayed as an anonymous mass coming to Europe. So it's migrant bodies moving to Europe. And we don't see individual faces, for example, and oftentimes we do not read about the histories, but the sheer numbers are debated. On the other hand, there is also a gender difference. In the news, when we hear about the sad drowning of migrants, for example, or how many migrants have been rescued, women, pregnant women, and children are often singled out. So we see that the embodiment is really matters also in terms of media coverage. What we also read in the media is that migrants are putting their lives at risk or putting their bodies at risk. So there are non-citizens, but they cannot distance themselves from their bodies because their bodies have to move to find refuge in the European Union. However, the mode of governing sometimes differs, or how certain institutions visualize the governing and also European border control. Here we see a map by the European Border Agency Frontex. So it's quite technocratic. We don't see any moving bodies. It's a disembodied mode of governance. And also in peace and conflict studies, we learned about what it makes for border patrol or for military personnel, for example. It makes a difference whether they're moving bodies, moving individuals that they attack, or whether it's just arrows moving towards Europe. So, and I think this is an issue you can, or you will also discuss after this seminar session in your group discussions. So, a brief response to the third question, what does it mean to be an embodied non-citizen in the EU? We see that the citizen and non-citizen divide remains. However, there are many different categories and a related stratification of rights. There is a trend in the European Union to expand social rights, but with clear limits. And there is a governing through and of gendered bodies, which might be disguised by technocratic policies. And in overall, to conclude this lecture, it is important to be sensitive and to have analytical categories and concepts for grasping the logics, the patterns, the contradictions of the different grounds of social inequality, of discrimination, and their embodied impact on citizens and non-citizens in the EU. Thank you very much for listening, and I will give you some further references and recommendations for readings in your studies. Thank you very much, and have a good time discussing this week's